The Silence of the Lambs introduced the world to the character of Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, and completely redefined the way that serial killers were portrayed on film, and is the only horror film ever to win Best Picture at the Oscars. In this video, I want to break down a few of my favorite scenes from The Silence of the Lambs, and also unpack the amazing but unsettling direction of director Jonathan Demme. So let's get into it. If you're new here, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. I'm a narrative writer, director, and producer, and have been working in LA for the last 10 years. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. The Silence of the Lambs was first released on February 14th, 1991, and it's ironic that they decided to put it out on Valentine's Day. The film went on to become the first and only horror film to date that has ever won Best Picture at the Oscars. Hannibal Lecter, as portrayed by Anthony Hopkins, is often cited as one of the greatest film villains of all time, and the American Film Institute even names Hannibal Lecter as the #1 film villain of all time, and Clarice Starling as the 6th greatest film hero of all time, as portrayed by Jodie Foster. The film went on to win 7 Academy Awards at the 1992 Oscars, including Best Actor for Jodie Foster, Best Actor for Anthony Hopkins, Best Directing for Jonathan Demme, and Best Adapted Screenplay by Ted Talley, and Best Picture. According to The Guardian, before The Silence of the Lambs, serial killers in films had been claw-handed boogeymen with melty faces and rubber masks. By contrast, Lecter was highly intelligent with impeccable manners, and played by an actor with impeccable credentials. Because of this, it completely redefined how killer characters and villains could be portrayed on screen, and added an entirely new level of depth, charisma, and intelligence. Part of the reason I also think the film is so successful on screen is that it was adapted by writer Ted Talley from the original novel Silence of the Lambs, written by Thomas Harris. Thomas Harris's grasp of the real world of detective work and policing is so intricate and detailed that it really lends a lot of credibility and ethos into the actual story, and the participation of the FBI and consulting on this film when they were in production also adds another level of credibility and groundedness that a lot of horror detective films don't really often have. So because of that, I think it makes it such an influential and superior entry, and redefined a lot of the further detective mysteries to come in later years. I really think The Silence of the Lambs has had such a major impact on the detective genre, and has really influenced a lot of the other detective horror films like Seven, Zodiac, a lot of David Fincher's work, and Longlegs as a more contemporary example. So with that set up, let's dive in to the scenes. Meet Crawford. Leading up to when we meet Jack Crawford, who ends up becoming Clarice Starling's boss, who's the one who assigns her the mission from the very beginning to investigate Lecter and try to see if she can find any leads on Buffalo Bill. I love that we establish so much of the actual Quantico, the training academy for the FBI that's in Northern Virginia, and it's amazing how many pieces of the actual facility we get to see before she ends up in Jack Crawford's office. So I really like that before that we're establishing, for one, how few women are actually there, and everyone else around her is men. She gets in the elevator surrounded by men. She's a foot shorter than them, so there's very much a clear distinction there that she's very much a woman in a man's world, especially in this field at this time. So right off the bat, one of the things they throw us right into is all of the photos along with the name Buffalo Bill, Skin's 5th victim. Already we're establishing very early on with visuals, with headlines, who the name of this killer is and what his nickname is in the press, and the fact that he has notoriety since he already has a nickname in the media based off what he does to his victims, which is, as we're starting to see these incredibly grisly photos, skins his victims, takes their flesh off. So far, all we're seeing is women that are skinned, but already we're establishing early on what the tone and sort of the level of violence we're going to see in this film is, which is pretty grisly in a lot of ways, without tipping the scale into outright gore at any point in the film. In my opinion, it still has this tasteful level of violence while discussing a lot of these much darker themes that reside below the surface in a way that we discuss but never explicitly show in the film, which is something I really enjoy. One of the other things that we establish early on is this language of intimate close-ups. A lot of the film feels very intimate because of the sheer number of close-ups that Jonathan Demme employs with his cinematographer Tak Fujimoto, which is another thing that I love about this film, is so much of it is shot very straightforward. It looks very naturalistic, the lighting, similar to The Exorcist. It doesn't have overly flashy lighting or too much shadow. It feels like everything is very much in plain view. Nothing is hiding in the shadows or in the darkness, which we tend to see in a lot more mysteries or detective movies made today. There's a lot darker lighting, there's a lot more shadow, especially in the films of Fincher. You get much more shadow and darkness. One of the other things I'll quickly comment about the use of establishing how many close-ups we're going to have is we really are investing in the characters. We want to know how they feel about moments, and I really like that we push in on Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, after she sees this headline of Buffalo Bill, his next victim, in these photos that are really horrific. It's a really smart choice to get her reaction to seeing how this is affecting her. And so much of this performance by Jodie Foster throughout the movie is brilliant because it's not a showy performance, but it's so subtle the way that she's able to internalize such traumatic events, but also handle them so deftly, and is also what makes her such a great protagonist, but also a great candidate to be in the FBI and investigate such horrific homicides and murders, such as the ones we're about to see. Also, some really great production design here that we're already establishing some of the locations of where the victims have been found. We're seeing photos of the victims, and we're seeing what are the common patterns already that we'll come to explore later in the film. But I really like that we're using production design here to tell us so much about the story before we ever even have Jack Crawford enter the room. So now Jack Crawford, played by Scott Glenn, enters. We finally see him. This film is actually shot with a little more of a shallow depth of field than a lot of the films in the 80s and 90s that we saw. So I think in contrast to films like The Exorcist or ones that were in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the focus really centers more on the subject and the background starts to fall off a little bit more, which is also what makes the close-ups so powerful because they really center your eye on the face and everything else around it seems to fall away, which is much more of a portrait style of shooting a face in photography. So I think this is also a good choice for this film, which wasn't quite as common when films were shot on film and throughout the 80s and 90s and before. So this is something I think really started to distinguish itself. That we see a lot of now is a lot more shallow depth of field is in a lot of films and TV shows nowadays in 2024, but this is something that isn't quite as common. So I think the close-up really shines when it's shallow, and I think we really established that here with the visual language that they created. So when Jack Crawford enters, it's very clear that he is making himself comfortable. He's taking off his jacket. He's literally putting his hands behind his head, kicking his feet back. So it's very interesting to see just how comfortable he's willing to get, especially around Starling. And also we're starting to establish how incredibly intelligent socially Clarice Starling is, where she's always placating. She's never revealing too much of her cards. She's always responding when people give her compliments with almost a joke back.
I gave you an A.
A-, sir.
She responds quickly. She doesn't really ever show her cards, and she knows that if she does and she gets too vulnerable, it will be harder to stand out and hold her ground as a woman in such a male-dominated field. So now that we've had our wide shot where everybody settles into the space, we move very quickly into these medium close-ups. And I think what they're trying to do is put you in the subjective point of view and the headspace of Clarice Starling. So when we cut to Jack, it looks like he's looking directly into the lens of the camera. I believe I read that he had the actors look very close to the lens, but not directly into it, so that it wasn't completely a fourth wall break, but it was very close to it. It almost feels like it, but it creates something that's even more unsettling, which is exactly what he's trying to provoke within the viewer. And this entire film does such a good job of putting you in the perspective of Clarice, who's our protagonist, and making you feel the uncomfort with the way they frame the characters talking to her by having them look almost directly at you. It's a very unsettling effect that hardly any other films employ, but when they do, it goes to such a great effect to really put us in the driver's seat with the protagonist. One thing we also establish is that Clarice Starling is not a pushover. She's very polite. She definitely has great manners. Every time she responds to somebody, very cordial, laughs, she smiles, but she's not a pushover. One thing I like is that Jack Crawford notes that in the past, when there was a seminar that he gave, she grilled him in the past.
Grilled me pretty hard, as I recall. recall on the Bureau's civil rights record in the Hoover years.
This is also a great detail that shows us she cares about civil rights, but also isn't afraid to speak her mind and try to make the department a better place for all people. So I think this also, again, makes us endear to her very quickly in the film. I also enjoy that we are only about 7 minutes into our film and we already introduce Hannibal's name.
Who's the subject?
The psychiatrist Hannibal Lecter.
Hannibal the cannibal.
It's going to be a little bit before we actually end up meeting him, but as I've always said before on this channel, I think great villains and great characters are often discussed and there's a build-up before them before we ever actually meet them. So I think Hannibal's a perfect example of someone that has this grand reputation already, this notorious, infamous reputation, and she says Hannibal the cannibal. So we're already starting to plant the seeds of who this very disturbing person is that we're going to meet, and now it just makes us all the more excited as an audience when we actually get to go meet him. So now we've moved out of our close-up coverage and we are getting back to the recentering where we're about to end the conversation. We're back in a wide shot, and this is a very pivotal line.
Lecter's been in prison for so many years now. Is there some connection between him and Buffalo Bill, maybe?
Clarice mentions is that up until now, there is no real connection between Hannibal Lecter, Buffalo Bill. She suggests, is there a connection? Why is the urgency happening now? Which brings all of the pieces of our story together, and she's really the catalyst for it. And so I think this is such a great line that asks, well, are they connected? And then we end up finding out the reasons that they are. But this really kind of connects all the pieces on the chessboard in this first big dialogue scene before we really ever catapult into our movie. So I think this is a great way to meet Crawford. It's a great way to meet Starling and establish who's our protagonist and also establish who's Lecter, who's Buffalo Bill. We literally lay out all of our main players in this game in this scene right here. So I think this is why it's a great dialogue scene that really catapults us into the movie. So the last few lines, we go back into the close-up coverage where it's the subjective POV. Crawford's looking at Clarice, and I think this is also a really great choice in that a lot of times we would end a scene on a wide shot and go into our next scene, which would bring us into another wide shot to establish the space of our next scene. But what I like is that we bring the energy back to again remind the audience of how scary and how manipulative Hannibal Lecter is.
And you're to tell him nothing personal, Starling. Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head.
So to really put that warning, not only for Clarice, but for us to sit forward and go, okay, we really better watch out for when we meet this Lecter character, which we do in the second scene, which is an amazing choice. There's also a nice pre-lap of when she asks what he is.
But never forget what he is.
And what is that?
Oh, he's a monster.
And then Chilton in the next scene answers monster. Meet Hannibal Lecter. So we meet Dr. Frederick Chilton, who is in charge of the Baltimore asylum that Hannibal Lecter is being kept in. This scene is great for a few reasons because it establishes, for one, how much of a scumbag Dr. Chilton is. He made a pass at Clarice already within the first few seconds of her being in the office.
You know, we get a lot of detectives here, but I must say I can't ever remember one as attractive.
And it also showcases Clarice's skill in navigating these kinds of men who are making passes at her while she's on the job. She's just trying to be a professional.
I'm sure this is a great town, Dr. Chilton, but
she does such a great job of deflecting and being personable while also not bruising his ego.
my instructions are to talk to Dr. Lecter and report back this afternoon.
I see.
And this is smart because it still allows her to do her job and get access to Lecter. And she knows that if she were to shut him down more aggressively, he might not let her have access as a way to retaliate. So I think, unfortunately, it's the situation that's a terrible one, but she's navigating it so professionally and is such a consummate professional in the context of being a woman on this job. The other thing we establish is that Dr. Chilton feels like Hannibal is a prized possession and is someone that he knows he might be able to use for his own fame and notoriety and exploitation.
From a research point of view, Lecter is our most prized asset.
So this is something we're starting to seed early on of how scummy Chilton is on multiple levels. As we start to move through the space of the hospital, we're starting to descend more and more levels. And again, I'll reiterate that on this channel a lot, I talk about how the descent or going downward, descending stairs, going down multiple levels is very much the symbolic descent into hell or the lair of the villain. So this very much still supports the idea of we go through subterranean levels of multiple different levels below ground until we finally enter the space where not only does it have a red light, but the red bars also symbolize very much that color of hell, or a hellish space, or a hellish glow. So this very much to me symbolizes that same theme of we're descending into Lecter's lair, where we're descending into hell, where we're going to meet this type of demon in a way. We also establish how much Lecter apparently hates Chilton, since he says,
Oh my, does he hate us? Thinks I'm his nemesis.
so that's also something that's important that will be able to be exploited later. This sequence is also incredibly well shot and directed and acted, because it's essentially a walk and talk, but we're moving through so many different spaces of this hospital, and very much like when we are seeing Clarice move through the FBI Academy at Quantico before she meets Jack Crawford. It's a really great way to not only establish exposition in the dialogue, and he's telling her all of these pieces of info about Lecter. Again, we're building up to, we're about to meet Lecter for the first time, and we're learning all of these things he's done.
His mouthpiece and restraints were removed for an EKG. When the nurse leaned over him, he did this to her.
But this is also a really great way to establish information and explore all the different levels while we're descending to meet Lecter. And so I really like the fact that this walk and talk has very quick camera movements. We're rounding corners. It's very much a stylish version of the walk and talk that has a lot of flair to it and makes the dialogue exposition so much more interesting as we hear it. The other pivotal information that Clarice uses against Dr. Chilton here is he assumes he's going to go with her to question Lecter, and she uses the information he volunteered for her that
if Lecter feels that you're his enemy, then, well, maybe we'll have more luck if I go in by myself.
to suggest she goes alone. This allows her to really connect with Lecter on a deeper level and really get the information from him and get him to talk in a way that none of the other men, none of the other people are able to, because Lecter's able to see something in Clarice that is much more genuine than a lot of the other people that are trying to just get him to talk or trying to exploit him. So this is a pivotal connection that allows her again to be our lead of information and for her to get info from Lecter in a way that nobody else can. And why it makes such a compelling two-hander between Lecter and Starling, because when they connect, it's riveting to watch them connect with each other and get this info out of each other in this game of cat and mouse, if you will. So when we first meet Lecter, he's behind the glass, he turns around, and he looks almost charming. He looks almost like a gentleman. His hair is slicked back. He has this shine in his eyes. It's amazing how he just has this gleam in his eye that's electric. And I think that's just a testament to Hopkins, his appearance, his instrument, his performance, what he's channeling internally. When he turns on that expression and his eyes go alive, there's nothing like it. I've never seen anything quite like that with any other actor, especially in this performance specifically. And I think it's why it's such a delight to watch him as a viewer, and also so unsettling every time. Even though I've seen this before, I rewatch it, I feel just as chilled to the core because of just how incredibly charismatic and suave he is with his expressions that almost seduces us in a way. And there's this moment where he leans forward and he's asking Clarice to get closer to see her credentials and asks her that in such a polite way. And I almost wonder if this is a nod to that iconic shot in Rear Window when Grace Kelly first enters the film and she almost enters from out of focus and brings her face close to the camera and she just looks gorgeous and there's this shallow depth of field. It almost is the same type of feeling, but except for Hannibal Lecter being his true intro for us as the audience to see him and his full expression in such an intimate setting. So I love the way they shoot these close-ups in this scene. It's so disturbing. The lighting, the quality of his face, just how close we are, and he's looking directly at us. It's just pierces me to the core with how creepy it is. And I think that's just a testament to the filmmaking and the performances. Just watching this performance, it's incredible because there's no music under it. The whole scene is purely just dialogue, and it's predominantly the same coverage of the tight close-up on Anthony Hopkins and then the medium close-up on Clarice. And it's just incredible how much they're using the same shots back and forth. They don't really even need to change the rhythm because we're so engaged in the performance, his acting as Lecter, her responses, and the fact that they're both on the other side of the glass trying to suss each other out to such an intense degree that it's such a great scene with so much subtext because of what they're not saying, but they're just trying to figure each other out.
Now then, tell me, what did Miggs say to you?
And there's some great pauses that Hopkins employs to really show us he's trying to read Starling.
That expires in 1 week. You're not real FBI, are you?
And already we establish how incredibly perceptive and intelligent and articulate he is. He's definitely one of the most charismatic, gentlemanly figures, especially as a killer, that I think we've ever seen on screen still to date. So it's such an unexpected character type that we usually see for a killer, especially a cannibal. What we learn is that Lecter is a former therapist, so part of his job was to uncover what was going on inside people's heads, and he was basically using psychological tricks to learn and decode different elements about why people are doing what they do. And so I think what we establish early on is that he has this fascination with Clarice. He immediately wants to get inside her head and know more about her, and he wants to learn more about her so he can psychoanalyze her. And he cuts basically straight to the point, asking her some of these more intense and invasive questions.
What did he say?
He said, I can smell your cunt.
To sort of test her and see how well she's able to keep her composure and resolve. So I think this is also very much how they start to build this off-kilter relationship that's really going to sustain itself throughout the rest of the film. This is such an amazing scene. Talk about an incredible way to meet a character and then spend this much time getting to know them, getting to know how they operate. I love that this is just a longer dialogue scene that tells us so much about what we need to know about character, but also the development of the story to move it forward. And we also establish the dynamic between Clarice and Lecter. And again, we get this incredible line during this run where
A census taker once tried to test me.
love how he mispronounces the Chianti, which is an Italian wine.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Again, further lending credibility to the fact that he has some knowledge of Italy. And he talks about the Belvedere in Florence, the building, which also the Belvedere has significance later in the plot because one of the victims was from Belvedere, Ohio. So that's also a nice little nod and Easter egg, but it shows us that he's very cultured. And I think we tend to think of Italian fine wine or dining as cultured or somebody who's traveled the world and, you know, knows a lot about a lot of things. I definitely think that it makes Lecter such a unique killer on his own and in his own right. It sets him apart in a league of his own from a lot of these other killers we've seen in a lot of the other horror films, especially that we've talked about. The other thing that we get that's important is a little bit of backstory exposition about Clarice's info that Lecter is able to perceive and look into.
But you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling?
And so this is something that I think we see slightly start to rattle Clarice before she composes herself.
And that accent you've tried so desperately to shed, pure West Virginia.
She has a nice quip back to him that shows it's not enough to fully rattle her.
But are you strong enough to point that high-powered perception at yourself?
She has more strength than she might appear to have, and she's willing to go toe-to-toe with him on an intellectual level when it comes to conversation.
Why don't you look at yourself and write down what you see? Maybe you're afraid to.
Which makes her a worthy adversary to go against Lecter this whole film, and why I think he starts to trust and respect her and give her more of the information that he doesn't give to any of her male counterparts. One thing that's amazing about the ending of this scene is we go back to our wide shots. She stands up. The score starts to come in a little bit as we're starting to think we're about to transition smoothly out of this scene.
Fly back to school now, little Starling.
And what's great is it takes another reverse, and as she's walking by, and the disgusting scene of Miggs who throws semen on her lands on her, probably one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen in a movie. It totally ratchets up the tension again to where all the other inmates are shouting at him. The score finally comes in dramatically, and the score by Howard Shore is also amazing. It's very cinematic. It's also a much more orchestral type score than we also hear in a lot of different detective movies, but I love that it comes in full. It swells dramatically as Lecter calls her back to his cell.
I would not have had that happen to you. Discourtesy is unspeakably ugly to me.
And it's incredible because the energy completely ratchets up. She goes back to his cell when he calls her, and he actually even mentions that what just happened to her he found incredibly disgusting. So what we also establish is he's started to develop this deep respect for her, and he even gives her a clue.
I'll give you a chance for what you love most.
What is that, Doc?
Advancement, of course. Listen carefully.
As to what's happening next that she wouldn't have got if that didn't happen to her. So I think it's a really great way to transition us out of this scene when we thought the energy was starting to diminish. All of a sudden we ratchet it back up, and then we get out of our scene, which is such a powerful filmmaking device that creates such engagement but also surprise.
Look deep within yourself, Clarice Starling. Go seek out Miss Moffat, an old patient of mine.
And honestly really sets our whole plot in motion now that she has a true lead to actually follow up on as a detective. Crucially, we also establish that once she gets out of the hospital, she does have a tear on her eye. She is visibly shaken, and she actually has a small breakdown in the parking lot near her car. And I think this is crucial because it shows us that she's human, further endears to us this did rattle her on a deeper level, but she had the professionalism not to show it in the presence of Lecter or any of the other inmates down there. So she was able to compartmentalize long enough to let it go, let the levee break only once she was out of their presence. And this is such an amazingly human moment because it shows us that these things are deeply traumatic. Dealing with killers like this, like Lecter, do get under your skin. And I love that we see this vulnerability from her, but she's able to compartmentalize in such a professional way, which makes her so good at her job as well. And then immediately we go into a shooting scene where she's back in training. She's giving it her all. She's firing a gun. She is ready to tackle this case head on. She's not going to let this take her down, at least not yet. That concludes part 1 of how Silence of the Lambs created the most charismatic killer ever. I want to hear from you. Comment below your favorite scene from Silence of the Lambs or your favorite memories from the first time you watched it. Let me know if there's any other films you want me to cover in a future video, and I will definitely make sure we get them covered. And for more movie breakdowns, you can check out more of my videos like the series that I did on The Exorcist, which you can find here. So definitely check it out. And stay tuned for next week where we'll continue to break down different scenes from Silence of the Lambs, and I'll make the case as to why it created the most charismatic killer ever, and also why it's fully deserving of its Best Picture win at the 1992 Oscars. So I will definitely see you then.